Good morning. Good morning, and good morning. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for our online audience for joining us virtually. Welcome to our panel on the resilience of informal politics. We're building on the previous panel, but I hope we will contrast some of the views that was raised in the previous panels. My name is Al-Shakeri, and I'm a senior researcher and director for the Middle East and North Africa program at SIBRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I am honored and delighted to be moderating this panel, and I'm really looking forward to join forces with my colleagues in this panel, with these engaged researchers, scholars, analysts, and civil society voices. We will move through different countries, through different contexts, from Iran to Iraq to Libya to Tunisia and the other way around as well. And before we delve into the discussion, please allow me to repeat what Hisham mentioned so eloquently earlier, some logistical points. A translation is available, English, Arabic, Arabic, English, in the room and also for our online audience. The session is recorded, and it will be live streamed and available on demand after that. And once we get to the Q&A session, I would like to ask you please to introduce yourself and keep your question brief, because I know very well there will be lots of questions and lots of discussions that we'll go through that. So the resilience of informal politics. What does it mean really? What does it mean in a region like North Africa and Middle East? And what are some of the key lessons that we have learned over the past years in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings from the lens of informal politics? There must be many lessons that we learned. And also, why do we still see it manifested? Why do we still see mobilization despite all the odds that we have out there? Why contentious politics and contentious collective actions are still there? They go up, they go down, but they are definitely there. Or is it just natural that contentious politics are part of the process when you live under repressive authoritarian regimes? Maybe that's just natural fit, that confrontation as a way of living is the way to go in such contexts. Many questions that we would like to address here from that lens of contentious politics. And what does it mean to engage in contentious political actions and collective actions? What does it mean really to expose the authorities, to claim the political space, to establish a new narrative, to create new networks for change, to build new narrative for change, but also to fill that leadership vacuum with a new leadership that is legitimate, representative, effective. And all of that, despite all the different challenges, failures, and sacrifices that activists, civil society actors, social movements go through. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And also it's really important to keep in mind that these informal politics, or what we can also call non-conventional ways of dealing with politics, non-conventional ways or avenues to primarily deviate from and challenge the current political systems, they challenge the status quo in these countries, and bring about change through different avenues to engage with politics. A lot can be discussed, and a lot can be addressed through the discussion, and this is why I'm extremely honored to be in the company of the four speakers that we will have today. I will follow Hisham's approach. I will not read the impressive bios that you all have, all the awards that you've been receiving, all the influence that you've done over the years. But briefly, we have with us Shadia Sadr, the co-founder and executive director for Justice for Iran, with her intervention, will focus on Iran and ask how these dynamics manifests, especially in the current dynamics and current day. We have Asma Khalifa, a research fellow and PhD candidate at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, and a Libyan activist, a Libyan society activist, also with a focus on Libya in the discussion. We have also Chaima Bouhlel with us, Associate Fellow with the Chatham House MENA program, and independent consultant and activist working especially on Tunisia. And finally, we have Hayder Al-Shakeri with us, Research Associate at the MENA program of the Chatham House here today. So maybe we'll start from North Africa and then move to Iran, starting with you, Chaima. And I would like to stress that all your reflections are based on your first-hand expertise and first-hand being in these lived realities, influencing them. And maybe the first question, why do these informal engagements with politics matter? Why these informal politics avenues matter? And when you engaged with them, what kind of objectives you wanted to achieve in the first place?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to hear what everyone else is doing and thinking. I usually think these opportunities are an opportunity to think out loud, to be detached a little bit from the realities we're living. It's a little bit dangerous these days to think out loud, live, and on the record. And you realize that how dangerous it could be once people start asking you, you're based in Tunis? And if people start asking you this question, you need to know that things are bad. So yes, I'm based in Tunis, and I think I do engage in a lot of informal politics, but I'm going to challenge this, the definition of what we mean by informal politics. But to give a very short answer to an extremely important question, why do we have contentious politics? As long as we have contentious forms of governance and regimes, we will continue to have contentious politics. And I think that is the only normal reaction to the realities that we live in. So even though we are taking a step back and trying to assess and be detached, I think we need to really see the reality that we're living in the mirror. And we need to look at ourselves, whether people who do believe that we can negotiate with regimes that are oppressive or non-democratic, or those who think that we need to work on the opposition. And I think both are extremely valid, but they need to start from a common understanding that maybe Tunisia was the last experience in the Middle East and North Africa where there was some kind of sense of formal and informal politics. So if we want to assess informal politics in Tunisia, I think the current president is the best case of resilience. So he is a political actor who is the result of informal politics, does not pertain to any form of formal organization or political party or association or anything. An assistant law professor who managed to gather a lot of support informally by meeting people and by talking about issues that actually mean a lot to people, and managed to continue the informal approach to politics even as president, so by discarding the constitution and discarding the rules of the game which he agreed upon, and discarding all forms of other formal politics, which is named intermediary structures. So we're talking about unions, associations, civil society, and media, so traditional and non-traditional media. So who is informal in this case? Is it the government, even if the approaches are extremely informal? Or is it formal actors who find themselves in the margins of informal politics? And I think if we want to understand the situation in Tunisia, and I promise that eventually I will try to be optimistic and see where the way's out, I think we need to make sure who is formal and who is informal, and based on what. But I know today we're talking about non-structured forms of politics. So partisan, citizen movements that happen to have demands regardless of whoever is in power and whatever tools they do have. And the reason why I started with understanding where the president comes from, because what happened in Tunisia after the presidential elections, and mainly after the 25th of July, is that you had a figure of the informal practice of politics co-opt the rest of movements because he does represent what citizen movements can mean like within formal politics. You see figures of protests going down, for example, and a lot of people who are supporting the regime currently use that as evidence that we are responding to people's needs because people are not protesting as much anymore. And we need to take that into consideration when we think about the reality of Tunisia, because eventually, I personally discuss politics in Tunisia because I think people should have a better life, and any form of politics should respond to that. The usual dull question that I use as a compass for me is the situation we are now making us closer to discussing public education, the least contentious topic, let's say. And that's usually how I measure. It is not because with a populist approach to politics in Tunisia now, informal politics has been reduced to accountability, which is a huge demand in Tunisia after the revolution, and it takes lots of forms. It's economic accountability, political, human rights related, transitional justice in Tunisia was supposed to respond to that, has failed on so many levels. But when the formal form of politics, which is through the state and through legitimate power, co-opts that discussion and takes what the popular demands and reduces them to very specific issues, while at the same time not allowing for any form of rational conclusions to be reached, whether through attacking the justice system and not allowing for any form of independence, not allowing any other political actors to help pave the way for any form of dialogue, actually mocking dialogues and saying that they are not national and they're not popular and they're not the demands of the people. So that is something that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about informal politics in Tunisia. In fact, civil society organizations are now the ones who are not leading the informal politics, because they are seen as also responsible for whatever atrocities are being framed that have happened after 2011, and are responsible for not responding to people's needs. So I know I'm not giving an answer. I'm just adding elements of reflection when we are approaching Tunisia, because political parties and associations and unions are now in the margin. They're not the formal or the informal form of politics, and the state is not necessarily setting an example of formal politics that opens margins for discussion and for demands.
I will come back to this notion or the distinction between formal and informal and this contrast between them and where does civil society fit in all of this. But maybe I move to Asma and Libya with a similar questions. To what extent the engagement with informal politics or informal avenues for politics in the case of Libya matters, especially if the people, thinking of what you just said, are not in the core of their political system. They are not represented. They are not heard. Their demands, their aspirations are not there. So if we can, based on your experience with all the work on Libya, how do they matter, and what was your objective through engaging through these channels in terms of creating change that you would like to see?
Well, I'll start that in Libya, in 2011 specifically, and up until Gaddafi was killed, there was not so much a distinction between formal and informal, because you had clear drawn lines of opposition, legitimized and supported by the international community, which still haunts us still today, I think, and an opposition that worked closely with civic organizations, humanitarian organizations that just sprouted in a setting of conflict. And you think that's strange because you already have a setting where there's a war, there's a conflict, so it's there should be already a contestation. But I haven't seen it until late 2011 when the opposition came to Tripoli, and it was mostly diaspora opposition. So I'd say they brought their baggage with them, politically speaking, into the country. And when I had access, and I have to underline several lines under accessibility when it comes to contentious politics, it was clear that they came with the attitude that we were complacent by living with Gaddafi for 4 decades. We enabled him to remain somehow, or we were all right with the status quo, and therefore we don't know what's best for us, we don't know what's good for us, and so the discussion of politics was for them how they can implement political projects that are copied from European or American, which is mind-boggling. But yes, that was the conversation. Whilst I was in the streets more often than not, or in conversations, and we had a very different discussions in the streets. When we asked people, well, we're going to have elections next year, what do you think about that? And people were like, what for? What are we doing with that? What is, I mean, it's really like, and this contrast was very evident to me, that there was a detachment in this formal politics where they were planning ahead with an election basically forced upon us to have, when there is very little political culture of practice of politics in the informal. And I think what's one of the factors that made 2011 very special for a lot of us who were engaged back then is the sense of ownership. So we took it upon ourselves then to bridge this gap between formal and informal, or between the street and these rooms where politicians spoke in to each other. How can we raise awareness? And I think Libyan civil society did tremendous work back then in monitoring elections, in making sure that there is transparency, reporting, and it was all still in the midst of war. I mean, war hasn't stopped in Libya since after 2011. War just continued to happen in different places, and that gave us the sense of responsibility. As activists, you have a sense of responsibility to community, ideally speaking, hopefully speaking. So that gives us a sense of responsibility that we need to push for this project of transition to end, or moving on, or to have our own culture of politics by engaging with our communities. And that the national level, and I would admit now that was a mistake, that we don't engage with the national level, or that they are these elites who don't know what they're talking about, or have absolutely no idea what's going on in the streets. I think, well, now I think it was a huge mistake. But it wasn't so for women's group. I would have to make a distinction that women do politics differently. And there's a lot of room for dialogue, there's a lot of room for mediation, because we always have to discuss power, right? Or we have to always approach power from a point of we need to advocate, or we need to change things. So I'd say that it was important to remain contentious, because we were guarding the revolution, or the ideals of the revolution. We were guarding the transition, we're guarding the change. And it gave me the space, especially until early 2013, to actually go to politicians and say, well, you can't do this, you have to do this and that, when they are discussing different issues. And that's not a position you can take when you are in the room, especially when political parties in Libya co-opted quota systems, they co-opted coalitions in order to have the zero-sum game of power. So it was very important, and still is very important, to have an opposition, not only because I think conflict is healthy when it's not violent. I think it serves also as a guard and as a balance, and hopefully sometimes that it connects actually what people need to people who would make decisions.
Two reflections based on this. One, if you can expand a little bit more, Asma, on how women do politics differently in the case of Libya. Just unpack it, please, a little bit more. But also this distinction that you made between people in the streets and the rooms or the institutions. It could be argued that people in the streets, they need these institutions, they need these rooms in order to create a political leadership, in order to create frameworks for legitimacy, accountability, representation. So what can some of the links that we can see there, or some of these dynamics between the streets and the institutions, if you can unpack these two questions?
You want me to answer now?
If you like.
Okay.
Trying to change the order a little bit and not make it too rigid. So.
Okay. So in the context of Libya, why women do politics differently, it's because we the conflict is extremely gendered, right? Power is incredibly imbalanced. There's men who have literally all the big guns, and we have nothing but ideals and ideas on what to do with our country. And so there's always this, we always approach the discussion of politics from, well, how can we together come up with something, and not, this is my project and this is the right way or the only way. Women do not have that privilege and luxury to say this is my way or the highway, as men do. And that conversation is incredibly helpful in politics in general, because you eventually reach what was said before about concessions, right? Or at least a compromise, or maybe a whole different idea. So and in these conversations in the corridor or outside the rooms, when we were pestering politicians or we were forcing them to sign to change their statements about different issues, or literally barricading the Prime Minister once in his office and not letting him out until he had us, it's a different sort of power that ensures that your community's voice has reached a space of decision-making. And while I think women should engage more in formal politics, in a more powerful form of politics, it's the reality is in Libya, a very patriarchal, conservative country. That's not ideal. And here I come to the dynamics. I think building institution does not have to be just formal. I'm a huge advocate and supporter for an innovative way of thinking in local governance. In fact, I think we don't need that sort of government on a national level. I think we need bureaucrats at a national level, and we need more decision-making at a local level. We need more people who are connected to their issues, have solutions for their issues to be able to make those sort of decisions. So I like those experiments where it's more regional or even local sort of power discussion than a national discussion, where I think it should be just bureaucracy.
We'll come to that and come back to that and connect it with what Chaima mentioned. But Hayder, moving to Iraq now, what are some of the key lessons that you've learned over the past years of engagement in contentious politics and social movements in Iraq?
Well, the case of Iraq is a bit of a new one, since it's 2 decades after the war, the invasion of Iraq. Both the formal and the informal kind of politics were reconstructed and reframed and reshaped by both the international community but also by the people. So there was a sort of a clean slate where we started to build the formal and the informal. At first, everyone was working together. There was some sort of a cooperation, but then slowly things became a bit more differentiated. The disillusionment within the people, with the political elite, has started shaping up more and more. So we start seeing protest movements and civil society being shaped up. The thing is, the international community and the diaspora, to a certain extent, they helped in shaping both the formal politics and the informal politics of the Iraqi post-2003. And what happened is that basis was not as well constructed as it should have been. So it was a bit shaky. It was a bit not working well when it comes to the clear lines between the formal and the informal, the civil society and the parliament and the ministers. So everyone was talking with everyone, and there was a class of political elite who controlled most of the decision making when it comes to both the formal and the informal. After the Arab Spring, I think Iraqis were inspired a bit, and I was one of the people who went to the streets, and we started demanding for basic things, like electricity, drinking water. It's something that is our right after 8-9 years of a new state, a new beginning, as they promised us. But then this was oppressed as it was in many other countries. But it re-emerged. It re-emerged again in 2013, where it brought ISIS because of the elite and their greed and their corruption. This slowly developed further, where in 2015 the informal and the formal, they kind of worked together. Many protesters on the street, they were supporting the prime minister to do reform. They didn't really go against the whole system. They were saying, Ali wiyak Ali. They were shouting for the prime minister to do reform and to step up against his own political class. But he didn't. And this helped others to actually take over and capture the informal. So now you have protesters who are parts of the political system, who are the elites themselves, calling their supporters to go on protest. And you see sometimes thousands of people on the streets supporting a certain political party, a certain figure, and sometimes they reach hundreds of thousands. But this disillusionment within the people, in Iraq is more than 40 million people now, it kept on boiling up and boiling up until 2019. In 2019, they said that's it. People on the street in various cities around the country, they started going out, taking the streets for days, for weeks, for months, and this was in solidarity with other countries in the region. We were shouting for Lebanon, we were shouting for Algeria, we were shouting for Iran at the time, and there was this kind of regional solidarity, transnational solidarity amongst us. These are all things that we can unpack later, but I'm just saying, the timeline of how things happened. Now what we have today, the informal kind of sphere is demanding accountability. The protesters in 2019, many of them were killed very violently. 600 people died, tens of thousands of injuries. Many are displaced, many are outside of the country, they cannot return. So now the need is for accountability. Everyone is demanding accountability, and the moving to the street again is not happening because of the capture of this protest movement. So there are other sorts of informal politics that are emerging. So for example, civil society and people are working on women's rights, for example. There are a new generation of women rights activists in Iraq where they are trying to work on various issues. Environmental activists, they're also everyone is trying to hold the elite accountable, but in different ways and in different spheres. The protests, they're not doing it so much because they know that once they go to the streets, someone will send their supporters and it will be captured again. One last thing I want to mention before I wrap up. After the protests in 2019, the protesters had demands where they wanted to change the electoral system, they wanted to change the government, and they succeeded in that. Now we have a new electoral system, we had a new government, but that government got into the system and it became part of the system. So the current the former prime minister and his staff, most of them got sucked into the system and became corrupt themselves. So now people are calling for accountability for the government that they kind of helped into taking positions. So sometimes even the informal, when it comes too close to the system, it gets sucked in. So one of the questions I have, and maybe we can unpack today, is how do we prevent that from happening? Because now we're seeing that it is very important to have collaboration between the formal and informal, but how do we do that to an extent and a degree where the system doesn't suck the informal in and make it part of the corrupt institution? And in Iraq, we're seeing some lessons and some examples, and I've been talking to some people who are starting their political parties, but they're talking constantly with civil society. There are these forums where they're talking with each other all the time, on a monthly basis, for example. 50 people in the room, a representative from different unions, different civil society initiatives, different political parties, different activists. They talk with each other. And they're started to think. So now there are emerging think tanks where, they're thinking about the political system, what do they want to do? How do they want to change things? So even the elections law, even, the penal code, how do we try to change that in a bit? So all of these things, they matter, but we need to be careful on how to prevent the informal from getting sucked into the formal.
Many fascinating points, and it's really fascinating to see that the three of you so far challenged this notion of distinction between formality and informality based on your first-hand experience and engagement with these conflicts, which is really a manifestation of contentious politics on stage here itself. And I would like to come back later on to this question of capturing the protest movements and how did it feel as for you as an activist, as painful as that it is, but also what kind of lessons. But one important point that you also highlighted relates to accountability. And I know, Shadia, accountability is in the core of your work. I believe it is the core of your objectives why you're engaging in all of this in the first place. But can you reflect, please, on Iran and what's happening and why you are taking and adopting this approach to induce change in the context of Iran with accountability as a core feature of that engagement?
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm so pleased that I have the opportunity here to talk a little bit about the situation, the current situation in Iran, and also how it has affected our work and accountability. But before that, I'd like to reflect on what Hayder and the other speakers mentioned about kind of collaboration between formal and informal politics, as this is also my understanding from informal politics, that it has to have a kind of dialogue, if not collaboration, with formal politics. Whilst what is happening in Iran is that the whole avenues to engage with informal politics have been closed down over the past 20 years. And now we cannot speak about any kind of informal politics, but what we are facing is revolutionary politics, which is actually in doesn't have any kind of dialogue with the brutal regime, but it's very much alive in terms of organizing itself toward dismantling the whole political establishment, the whole formal politics system. And back to your question about why I have chosen the path to focus my work and the work of my organization on accountability. So perhaps just quickly going through my personal story would help to understand, because it's just not a unique story by any means. So when you are born as a girl in Iran, so you soon understand and learn that, so you are considered as a second-class citizen, and especially when you don't belong to a privileged background, and then so you want to change it. So for me, as so many other women in Iran, becoming feminists, engaging with women's movement, or even at a different levels, so individual, organizational, or even transnational level, was not actually a kind of choice, but was the natural path to take. And then as a very young lawyer, my work was focused on saving women who had been sentenced to death by stoning, and also trying to eliminate discriminatory laws and practices. But then in 2007, exactly March 2007, exactly 16 years ago, this time I was in a solitary confinement in the Green Prison because I was arrested, and our center, our legal center for vulnerable women, was shut down by the Ministry of Intelligence. I was released on bail. We tried to reorganize ourselves, and then again I was arrested in 2009 in a peaceful demonstration. I was released on bail, and I had to leave the country. And that was the point that I realized that without a meaningful structural change, a structural political change, achieving women's rights and human rights is impossible in the context of the Islamic Republic. And that was a journey that millions of Iranians have gone through. They have invested over 2 decades on the idea of reform, And they invested a lot on the reformists, hoping that they would bring real changes. And it all turned futile and hopeless. And then since 2017, and one of the main and core issues was the chronic impunity that all perpetrators have enjoyed, absolute impunity and absolute lack of accountability. So one of the reasons that people in 2017 and then 2019 came to the street demanding their rights and asking the governments to go away was the fact that they couldn't actually find any opportunity, any avenue to hold the perpetrators or those responsible for crackdown, for corruption, for human rights abuses accountable. And that was the journey that I personally went through, and that's why we established our organization, Justice for Iran, to hold the perpetrators, to use the international mechanisms as much as the limited accountable. And then since September last year, when the Women Life Freedom Revolution began, in protest to the death of Jina Mahsa Amini in the custody of the morality police. So the protest began with the demands of abolishing the mandatory hijab. And the patrol police, that was one of the mechanisms, and is still a mechanism to enforce those compulsory hijab rules. But then quickly, very quickly, like in 1 or 2 days after the protest began, the protesters started shouting death to the dictator, asking for the Islamic Republic to go away. So they actually quickly created a link between women's rights, human rights demands, and the necessity of changing or having a fundamental political change. And this is where we are now at the moment. So the question is not, I think to me, is not how can formal and informal politics can have a kind of dialogue or contribute, how can informal politics contribute to the formal politics? The question for the majority of Iranians at the moment is, how can this revolutionary movement succeed? How can we achieve a secular democracy where everyone or every institution who have been responsible for human rights abuses held accountable?
And that was actually my next question, but I will go to the audience. But what are some of these prerequisites for these collective contentious actions to continue and transform into a social movement, sustained, maybe institutionalized, disruptive, and so on? But we'll come to that in a second. I would like to take 3 questions or 3 brief interventions. Please, I would like to remind you to introduce yourself, and let's start with the back. You have 2 hands. We start the corner on my left. Yes, in front of you.
Hi, good morning. My name is James Trigg. I'm a senior research analyst with Janes. First of all, I'd just like to thank all of the panelists for their contributions. It's been really engaging so far. I think it's been touched on slightly, but I just wanted to get the panelists' kind of perceptions on, with informal politics, social movements, especially across the Middle East and North Africa, we've seen kind of 2, at least to my perception, 2 main forms. Either kind of, as in Tunisia, for example, the protests against the president are well led by opposition leaders, or not well led, but they are led clearly by opposition leaders who are well identified. In Algeria and other countries, they are less clearly hierarchical movements. They're far more kind of civilian-led, amorphous organizations. I'm just curious if the panel have any thoughts on which is more likely to be successful in these situations, given that in the case of opposition-led movements, the state can be brought to bear quite quickly, arrests can be made, people can be detained, movements can be decapitated, whereas in the case of more amorphous situations, they can be captured instead by other groups like the military or opposition parties who hijack movements to suit their own ends. I'm just curious what the panel's opinions are of which method is likely to be more successful in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you please pass the mic next to you?
Thank you. I'm Valeria Scudo, an intelligence analyst with Sibylline. Thank you all for your insights, and it's something that has been briefly mentioned on the role of the diaspora and diaspora movements, and I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts on how this has changed since, for example, 2011 in Libya, and particularly in the case of Iran, what are the prospects for sort of connectivity and coordination with the current protest movement? Thank you.
One final question from this side. Please, in the middle.
Thank you very much. Martasam, a doctoral student at Oxford. My question is actually about if we want to kind of address this resilience in a sense, like where does political economy fall into this picture? Because we always have this discussion on, how to include some solutions in the political economy. And if you see the reports of the World Bank on Iraq, for instance, it's really doesn't address some of these institutional exclusion, the polity model, for instance. And I always find an interesting link between informal politics and informality in general, in the everyday living conditions of people, let's say in the city like Baghdad or Mosul. And this has an interesting link, for instance, when you say that some elites actually kind of start to represent these informal local communities in a sense. So I would like to hear more from you on where do you find this link between, again, some political economy conditions, but also actually very local dynamics of these groups.
Thank you very much for these interventions and excellent questions. Shadia, maybe we start with you with reflections on a couple of questions.
Yeah, I think regarding the question of how we make sure that the progressive forces or informal politics have not become a tool for repressive regimes or forces again and again, whilst we are in the middle of a social movement for real change. So this is exactly the question that we as human rights advocates, feminists, have been asking ourselves, because we unfortunately, in the case of Iran, we have a very, very bitter experience of the 1979 revolution, when women were an important part of the revolution, but were the first group that lost all of their rights right after the revolution, even before the new constitution was passed. The leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, so he annulled all of the rights that women had fought for them very hard to get, in terms of the family and civil rights and right to divorce, right to custody, so on and so forth. And then the compulsory hijab was started to establish and to introduce to the society. So we are now in the situation that, having that in our mind and in our collective memory, we are very afraid of the same thing would be happening again if we are not very careful of, and we have not organized ourselves around the minimum demands that any kind of revolutionary force or opposition or political parties that would take the power in the future have to consider in their new constitution, so on and so forth. So we have seen different charters. For example, today on the International Women's Day, so before I came here, I saw 3 different charters issued by 3 different women's rights groups. They wanted those charters to be a part of the new constitution. So I think we should be very, very careful at the moment, and we should be, because the politics even now, the message of the woman life freedom have been ignored by so many political forces. So it's just a constant watching of the political sphere. And then reflecting to the question about the role of diaspora. So the Iranian diaspora has played a great role in terms of engaging international community with what is happening in Iran. But I think, and it's not only my opinion, it's the opinion of so many human rights activists, I think we need to, as a diaspora community, as activists in exiles, we need to just support the voice of those who are in Iran, and the organizations, unions, feminist groups that have grassroots supports inside the country. For example, the Teachers Association, they managed to call for another nationwide protest yesterday, protesting the poisoning of the school years by likely a gas attack yesterday, whilst for weeks we didn't see any street protests or too much street protests. So these organizations, or the organizations, feminist groups and unionists, are the ones that are paying the prices, are the ones that they have networked inside the country, and are the ones that they have manifested their minimum demands in a charter signed by 20 civil society groups. I think we need to amplify those voices and see and create a unity in diversity as a diaspora community.
Thank you. Chaima, can I move to you with your reflections on these insights and questions from the audience?
Yes. Which is more successful, which I think is James' question. I think it depends on what we mean by success. And I'm not trying to answer every question with another question, but I'm just trying to say that there still is no agreement, at least in Tunisia, on what success means in a popular sense. I think the opposition, which is mainly comprised of political and civil society elite, believe that success is going back to, some say it's going back to the 2014 constitution, some say it's starting from there and maybe amending it, but it's definitely winning a battle with the current regime. That would be success. Whether that means like undoing the legislative elections or the president resigning or whatever that means. But I think on a more popular sense, success has to mean that whatever regime comes needs to be able to respond or to improve people's lives. And I think, unfortunately, those might not mean the exact same thing. And I think if there's any way out is to align what success means by the political elite to one that is a popular definition, in a sense that it responds to the largest group possible while taking into consideration minorities. And that is not an easy way out, and I think we always thought that we can achieve that by omitting certain steps, but you simply can't. I think you need to have successes, and here I join forces with whoever says that local level is the way to go, because I think it is the only way to go if you want to be able to build something with existing regimes that are almost impossible to penetrate on a national level, if you do not want to use tools that could lead to civil war. It's as, like it's for me, it's as simple as that. So the success would be to manage to uphold democratic and human rights principles and actually prove that they could produce some kind of improvement in people's lives, and I think that is possible. Mm-hmm. However, something that I think we also need to take into consideration is to what extent is that considered normalizing? And this is a very popular question in Tunisia now, and I will drop a question that is being asked, and there's no answer. I have my personal answer to it, but I also am very compelled by the opposing answer, which is we have municipal elections coming up. One thing that was surprising in Tunisia is that everyone was expecting that everything that is reminiscent of the 2014 constitution will be erased. One thing wasn't. Municipal councils that actually had opposition political parties represented as majority parties. They were not dissolved. We can go on and on why that was. Was it like a political maneuver? Was it anyway? So we have elections coming up, and they kind of escape the constitutional question of are they based on which constitution, because their mandate was actually it's ending based on the 2014 constitution. So, as opposition or formal or informal actors, what is better for Tunisia and whatever, and the people and the democratic dream that everyone has, to hold the elections or to boycott them? So, again, I'm participating with another question, but it's just to answer that the success can mean different things, and I think unless opposition actually have space to discuss this safely without questioning people's principles or commitment to democracy or whatnot, actually seeing what's on the ground, looking at other countries. I mean, when I see Iran and Iraq and Libya that have, and other countries, Lebanon and Egypt and Morocco, where we're kind of starting for the first time since 2011 from similar grounds of absence of solid democratic standpoints, at least. What choices have they made? What arguments were used to actually battle the question of normalizing with the existing regime, but also keeping spaces for political action? Because I think what's happening in Tunisia that is more dangerous than losing the constitution and elections, or a parliament that was legitimately elected, is losing political action. And I think what success would look like is keeping margins for political action open in a way that even if generations will be, it will take generations for us to go back to any kind of democratic discussion, what are we keeping, what premise for any kind of political maturity are we creating if another revolution happens or change or whatever?
We'll come back to the notion of losing political action and also that local level is the way to go. But before that, Hayder, going to you, and in particular maybe the question about the political economy and the local dynamics.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think in Iraq, in general, there is no long-term planning. So when it comes to the political economy, when it comes to those kind of long-term agendas, the political parties, they really focus on the short-term goals for them. So for the next year, 2 years, maybe 3 years maximum, so within their electoral cycle. I'll just give you an example. Right now, in order to stop people from protesting, the parliament voted on giving 650,000 jobs, new jobs, to the public sector. So adding that to Iraq's budget, taking advantage of the very high oil prices, and not taking into consideration, the future years, what's going to happen. And Iraq is a rentier state. More than 95% of our budget is dependent on oil. So when it comes to decisions like that, when we see that they're adding more than 10% of additional jobs to the public sector, then this is the kind of thinking that they are doing. And when it comes to local dynamics, I think I do agree that we need to focus on the local, and I think also the political elite are realizing this. So for example, we are seeing that, for example, in the Kurdistan region, there is more kind of give and take between the political elite and the people. So there is some sort of development, there is some sort of infrastructure, but at the same time there is a lot of corruption. In Basra, for example, it's one of the richest cities in the world because of all the oil fields that are in Basra. But what the political elite have been doing, they haven't been giving Basra anything. Basra, if you open the tap, you'll get, as they say in Basra, Nescafe, because of how dirty the water is. Now they're not getting Nescafe, they're getting just polluted water. Sometimes it makes them sick. So they're improving bit by bit. So you'll see the people saying, oh, this guy is better than the previous guy because he's giving me some services. So the elite are realizing some of these tricks that they can link with the people locally in order to do this. And Iraq is also going to experience government council elections within the next year. And the political elite, what they're trying to do in the parliament right now is to change the electoral law in a way that will be in their advantage. So only big political parties who have kind of funding, who are benefiting from the state now, who are taking advantage of the state, can get the votes and can win in those elections. And the political elite have also captured, in addition to capturing the kind of the protest movement and other actors, they also captured ministries and government institutions. So you see that ministries and funding to the ministries is going to political parties. Each political party in Iraq has its own economic committee where, you know, they decide which contracts in that ministry and how it can go to certain political parties. And through that, they give the jobs, the 650,000 jobs, they give it to their constituents. So, you know, they some sort of a guarantee in the next election cycle, they'll get the votes of at least, you know, 10, 20,000 people, which, if matched with the right electoral system, you know, they'll guarantee a seat. So it is kind of difficult to maneuver these things, but, you know, the civil society and the international community, to a certain extent, you mentioned the IMF and the World Bank, they are pushing in a certain direction. But they're also supporting the political elite in a way. So, for example, the IMF publishes a report, but then, you know, you see the World Bank president going to Iraq and meeting with, you know, not just political party leaders, but sometimes, you know, other actors. You see the Secretary General meeting with militia leaders. So these things matter. They matter very much when it comes to the dynamics between how to affect change and how to, you know, get the international community and international organizations, multilateral organizations, to get Iraq on the right path when it comes to the political economy or planning for the future.
Thank you, Hayder. Asma, over to you, but I would like to add a twist also to what was mentioned earlier, building on Chaima's point that local level is the way to go. Maybe we just need to problematize that a little bit, because of course it sounds right and it is right, but also there is this macro paradox that we could see lots of successes at the micro level, but lots of failures at the macro level. And also we don't see this trickle-up effect. You know, we're talking about effective, successful initiatives, for example, at local level. They could be short-term, they could be relatively long-term, but still they don't trickle up. So is that something even imaginable, this trickle-up effect from micro to macro level? But also feel free, please, to address the additional questions.
Okay, I think the challenge for the local is exactly the economy and distribution of wealth. It's an issue of who has the money and how effectively to use that money. And then, of course, it's in our regions, at least, the issue of corruption is a massive one. How can you ensure that then, if there is money, then it goes into these services and the needs and all of these issues are addressed? And I'm not romanticizing the local. I think I would support it as an experiment. But I think it's an important decolonial exercise in our regions because clearly all of these republic or parliamentarian or whatever form of governments are not working. And in a way, they are still an extension of a colonial influence where we have to copy someone else's model of governance to ourselves, where we haven't yet figured out what sort of nations we want to build. I mean, in Libya especially, it circles back always to a question of nation building, right? What is a Libya for Libyans now, after, 40 years of Jamahiri, as Gaddafi's Jamahiri, his own farm experiment, and a very brief kingdom era from a colonial. So it's a question of what could we do how can we change our understanding of power, and how can we more practice it? And I think that brings me the question. I think Chaima, you did not, I think, answer the success very properly, but the leadership is an important question. It doesn't matter if it's grassroots or if it's opposition or a mix of both. What makes a leadership successful for social movements is durability, transparency, communication, ability to engage, ability to continue to recruit, and to think that their movements are across time, intergenerational. All these conditions make a movement more durable and also to think that the objectives, reaching an objective, which I think social movements needs to stop doing in the regions, which let's change a regime, has to be more specific than that. You have to have movements for different sectors, for different structures of oppression, and then thinking about how to change regime. So it's the kind of leadership, I think that's what's important. The role of diaspora has changed a lot, of course, in Libya. I mean, now the diaspora has been in Libya for over a decade. I am now a diaspora, even though I'm very reluctant to admit it. And so what could they do and what diaspora could do? I think diaspora can be extremely vital to movements and to civic spaces, to protest movements in the region, because you could bring out issues, you could address, you could speak, you could advocate when people cannot and are silenced and are oppressed and are jailed. But it has to come from a space of reflection, a space of humility, and understanding that the stakes are much higher for them, and so they take the lead on any issue. And so that communication has to be clear, not to diminish an agency of any person who belongs to that country, but the people who live in the country facing any consequences should have the lead of any intervention from a diaspora.
Thank you. Before we take the two final questions, I would like to ask the panelists if you have any reflections on, brief reflections on that you would like to add now.
Yeah, I can challenge you, Asma, on something that I agree with, but I also think we need to...
You don't have that question.
How much can we experiment? I mean, and the reason why I think local level is very attractive, aside from, I think it's the only possible form of government that respects humans because it's on a human level. But it's also a way where you can experiment things without having a generalized risk, which is very attractive, I think, even as a way to mitigate risk. I think that's really important. But what's happening in Tunisia, for example, is that the level of experimenting is taking place on a national level. And it's based on what you were saying. It's based on, let's challenge this idea that we need parliaments. This is said by the president. Let's challenge this idea that you need intermediary structures that, let's talk to the people directly. And this can derail very easily. So I guess, do we have, the question could be, do we have what it takes to be able to experiment? And I think the answer to that is what I call political maturity, maybe, but that's also based on a bias. Is it institutions, but those are also the post-colonial. So where do we start from? And is it cultural? And I don't think that's the case, because that's also a very post-colonial way of looking at ourselves. And the counter-argument of what I'm saying is that people so the opposition, the elite, are saying we have endured 10 years of non-delivery because that is better than having experiments where things can derail. And I think answering this question will shape the narrative, at least in Tunisia, and will be very important in how it can be adopted as a narrative as well across countries. Because if we can say, yes, we're experimenting right now, you've resolved everything. If you say, no, it's better not to experiment to that extent, then the 10 years are the solution. And I think it's an important place to start from.
Thank you. We have 10 more minutes left. We have one question here and one question in front, please. The gentleman next.
Hello, thank you all for such an enlightening session. So basically, I want to look at the informal politics in the Middle East from more
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, Islam. I'm doing Master in Queen Mary, Development Policy and International Business. So basically, when looking at the Arab Spring moment in 2011, you got a totally different international scene in terms of thriving neoliberal narrative. You got Obama in the United States, you got David Cameron here in the UK. So, and there was real concern, a real global concern about democratization and human rights in the Middle East. Political Islam is still there. The Middle East is still under focus. But here now, and this year, after the rise of populism and in the West, growing suspicions, skepticism about neoliberal narrative in general, you got the Russia-Ukraine war. The interest in the Middle East is definitely declining with the United States and all the West heading east. And definitely, I guess, and if there is any focus or attention to be paid in to the Middle East, democracy and human rights may be the latest issues to be discussed. So at the moment of 2011, with all those factors, you got the international community, and the speakers already highlighted that, the role it provided to cater a safe backyard for practicing politics when formal politics space was not there. So now you have the death of the space of formal politics in most of the Arab Spring countries, especially with Tunisia recently joining the democratic collapse in the region. And at the same time, the informal politics doesn't have the same support it used to have from international community or attention in 2023. So how do you think this gonna be, that's gonna affect the informal politics? Yeah, at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One final question in front, please.
Yeah, so I'm Andy. I work in Parliament on genocide and atrocity prevention. I'm really keen to hear about engagement with from grassroots and local communities to marking atrocities and trying to get justice and accountability both at national level but also working internationally.
Thank you. And the final question in front, please. Here, please, in front. Thank you.
Hilda, Centre for National Peacebuilding. Thank you very much for exploring informal and formal politics in the way you have, but I think the underlying theme was a question about avenues to empowerment and to emancipation. I don't know whether you're aware of an organization called ICLEI, which is an international body that covers about 70% of urban populations, which has used the environmental sustainability agenda as its kind of, if you like, common theme, which also links into the sustainable development agenda. Those are uncontested political movements, if you like, that use local solutions, which is what you've been looking for. And they are worldwide, and they are already organized, and they would possibly be a useful platform for translating what you also explored in the first panel, how to move forward to solutions in a way that is very difficult to contest by people who are empowered, are in power, but are not empowering.
We have very few minutes to reflect on all these questions, so I would like to ask you to pick and choose whatever you like, but also bring a futuristic twist. What kind of future action you're planning to do or hoping to do to bring about change? Can we start with you, Chaima?
Yeah, I just want to briefly talk about the question on accountability and accountability mechanisms. So I think in the case of countries like Iran, where all avenues, domestic avenues for accountabilities are closed, and you have very limited options at the international level, so you have to be very, very creative. For instance, in 2019, there was another nationwide protest which was brutally suppressed by the government. The international community didn't pay any attention to the brutal crackdown. And then our organization, together with two other organizations, created a People's Tribunal, an international People's Tribunal, and invited 6 renowned international lawyers to investigate the crime. In terms of engaging with the grassroots and the victims' communities, so we made a public call, and in a very short amount of time, over 300 people risked their lives, contacted the tribunal, and provided it with evidence, first-hand evidence. We had 2 hearings in London here, and one of our judges, Elham Saudi, is here. She can just talk about their own experience because they were impartial, they were independent. But then, so the judgment of the tribunal is a vital tool for us for advocacy to end impunity in Iran. And so this is what basically what we are doing now, and what we have, like in addition to what already we have done. So we think that if this revolution succeeds in terms of the future plans, So we are in a very good position to contribute to the independent judiciary, whatever it like, and also justice, transitional justice process, whatever process it will be, fact-finding commissions, criminal proceedings, a combination of both, because we in Justice for Iran have documented massively the human rights violations and also information about perpetrators. So I think our contribution to this revolution and to the next phase of future Iran, a democratic Iran, would be actually helping to establish that judicial process and also like an independent judiciary, as well as to ensure that every single perpetrators will be held accountable, which is a very, very difficult task. We can learn from your experiences in Tunisia, in Libya, and in Iraq. I know that it's a very complicated task, but it's a demand that the Iranian peoples have had for more than a century.
Hayder.
No, thank you very much. And I'm just going to go to the question of the international community. I think we shouldn't really overemphasize the role of the international community, because after all, donor communities and the international agenda, every single country is governed by their own constituents. They have their own priorities, and you said it yourself. So we shouldn't really overemphasize their role, but they can help and they can support. Some of the ways they can support is just to stop legitimizing certain individuals and certain groups where they are, basically taking over the formal and the informal spaces where discussions can take place. So this can take us back to, the minorities and the genocide, where this is a success story for the international community, where they really supported the Yazidis, for example, in getting some sort of a way out. But there are still many kind of loose ends, and, in Iraq in particular, the Yazidis cannot really do much. But the international community really helped, from abroad to help in getting some sort of accountability for a group that has been very much oppressed in Iraq. And on the role of the environment as a way of working, and I think, like we in Iraq, we realize this, and being in a country where the environment is declining a lot, and we have one of the worst things we are seeing now, 50+ degrees every summer for many days. Many of the activists, they start working on this, but who are not realizing it are the decision makers themselves. They're not really seeing that this is a priority, and sometimes they're oppressing it when it comes in contrast with their kind of needs. So, for example, I have a friend who was talking about dumping toxic waste into the Tigris River. She got threats right away from some sort of groups and political elite where they were discussing this kind of incident. Another example is a friend who got kidnapped a few weeks ago because he was active and he was crossing a political line. Yeah, so we need to be careful in these spaces as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma.
I'll answer you, Chaima. Thanks for your question. I think it's extremely important. Well, I would say that experiments happen organically. When there is a vacuum, people jump in and do, whether it's councils, municipalities, civil society organizations, unions, whatever it is, collectives, communes, people fill in these sort of gaps. But what you're asking, which is a very important question when it comes to human behavior, politically speaking, that is the need for boundaries when experimenting with people's lives, right? Because what Qais Said is doing is not an experiment. In fact, I think he took a few pages of the Green Book, a bit of Gaddafi in him, because what he's saying is he's making an excuse that he's experimenting with a new political system in order to fully become an autocracy, to fully take power. He's not experimenting of power sharing and changing a system. He's doing it so that he would become eventually the supreme leader of Tunisia. So you need a form of boundary, because chaos in politics is extremely dangerous. And so any informal experimental organization has to be based in a value system, and that for me is a human rights approach, a human security approach. So you don't go off the rails when trying to find a new way of politics. You don't have to chuck everything out of the window. Past experiences are important, lessons from the world are important, learning from other communities are important. But it's important not to also box ourselves so much that we need to have a democratic state in a way the West would be satisfied with, that we continuously fail and relapse into conflict.
Final word.
Amen to that, Asma. And I just want to nuance the idea of international community, because there's the formal and the informal. And the international community, there's the southern and there's the northern, and there's the Arab and there's the non-Arab. There's Italy and France, who were very happy with the revolution, but are extremely happy with the migration policies in Tunisia. If you want to talk about informal politics in Tunisia, there's a huge movement against racism and fascism that is taking place, which was in response. But whoever is reaping the goods of the racist movement that is taking place are European countries that want to stop migration and want Tunisia to become the southern police of the Mediterranean. So we need to talk about this. And I think one way to balance this impact is for the international community to also keep stories from Iraq, Iran, Tunisia, Libya alive, but not only as anecdotes, but to also link them in how it impacts them. Because, and this is maybe the positive note that I want to let out. So in Tunisia, we used to feel like we had a lot of pressure to keep our experience healthy and alive, so it can be used as an example for other places. But now, and then, we used to look at other countries as beacons of hope. Tunisia was not the only beacon of hope. And this can only happen if, as cliche as this sounds, if we stop seeing our local context as confined contexts. More stability in Libya is more stability in Tunisia. Better democratic discussion in the UK about migration will lead to embarrassment of the Italian government and the French, and this will impact Tunisia. And we need to reach the point where we can articulate this if we want to have a human rights approach, because that's a universal approach. It's not based on nations or based on borders.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all these reflections. We reached the end. I'm sorry that we have to conclude the session now. But really, thank you so much for all the engagement, with all the questions, for all the insights. And all this reminds me of the main slogan of the youth movement in Palestine in 2021 in the Manifesto for Dignity and Freedom, where they said liberation is within our reach. And I think this applies to all of us. And one entry point, and to link this with what Ilham mentioned earlier, one entry point that I see here is to shift and transform from what I could call menu of Ilham, to play with the words, to a menu of Ilham, so a menu compared to menu of Ilham. And this is really, we can only do that through joining forces, and I think this panel really illustrated how we can create that transformation. So thank you all very much for that. And please, I would like to let you know that the lunch is waiting for you upstairs, so enjoy the lunch. I would like to thank all the translators, and we hope we were kind to them. And finally, please come back at 1:45 sharp to start the next session on culture and contentious. Thank you so much.